The Gilgo Beach murders. It's a case that's captivated and horrified people for over a decade, right? And one that's really kind of, I guess, haunted Long Island for all these years.
Yeah.
So we're gonna take a deep dive into this complicated case, starting from that initial discovery back in 2010, and following the twisted path that led to the recent arrest of Rex Heuermann.
And I think what makes this case so fascinating is that it didn't start out as a serial killer investigation. It started as a missing persons case
Yeah,
with Shannon Gilbert,
right.
and it ended up uncovering this horrifying series of murders that had gone unsolved for years.
It's almost like the case chose the investigators, like
Yeah,
they set out looking for one person and stumbled onto something much, much larger and much more horrific.
absolutely. In December of 2010, police were out searching for Shannon Gilbert, and they ended up finding the first set of remains. Not hers, but another woman's.
Right.
Soon after, 3 more bodies were discovered.
Wow.
All young women, all petite, all working as escorts. And that's where we get the name the Gilgo Four from. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello.
And 3 of the Gilgo Four were found wrapped in burlap. It's such a chilling and specific detail. I mean, does that suggest anything to you?
Well, it raises a lot of questions. The use of burlap, especially in this way, could point to a connection to hunting.
Ah.
Hunters often use burlap for a lot of things, like wrapping game or creating blinds.
So are we looking at a possible hunter as the killer? Is that too simplistic?
It's definitely a possibility we should consider, but it's important not to jump to any conclusions at this stage. We know that serial killers often have this overwhelming need for control, this desire to exert power over their victims. And the act of wrapping the bodies this way could be some sort of ritualistic element, a way to almost dehumanize the victims
Right.
and assert their dominance.
That's a really disturbing thought, but it makes sense. And of course, we can't forget about Shannon Gilbert. Even though her remains weren't found till much later and her death hasn't been officially linked to the other murders, her disappearance was the catalyst for this whole investigation.
Yeah, you're right. It was.
Yeah.
And had she not vanished, the other victims may never have been discovered, which is just a really chilling reminder of how interconnected these events can be.
Absolutely. And then there's the psychological aspect of this case, which is terrifying. The fact that someone was making taunting phone calls
Yeah,
from Melissa Barthelемy's phone to her younger sister.
awful.
I can't even imagine the cruelty of that.
It's a classic example of a perpetrator wanting to insert themselves into the story,
Yeah.
into the narrative. They want to be acknowledged. They want to feel powerful, even if it means tormenting the families of their victims.
Yeah, I mean, just heartless. And it's interesting because for years, those calls were all investigators had to go on.
Right, right.
Leads went cold, theories were debated, but the killer remained a shadow. I mean, even when more remains were found and we see this clear pattern, for a decade they couldn't catch him.
Yeah, and it wasn't until July of 2023 that a break finally came. And I think it shocked everyone.
Yeah.
The arrest of Rex Heuermann, a Long Island architect. He had a family, successful career, lived a seemingly normal life. It's hard to reconcile that image with the horrific crimes he's now accused of.
Total double life. And how did they finally catch him after all these years? I mean, what finally led them to Heuermann?
Well, it was a combination of things, really. But what sealed the deal was DNA technology.
Okay.
Investigators were able to link Heuermann to the murders with a discarded pizza crust.
A pizza crust.
I know, right?
Wow.
But it was found in Manhattan, and they were able to get DNA from the crust and match it to hairs that were found on some of the victims.
So it was a total game changer.
It was.
What was Heuermann's reaction when he was arrested?
He's maintained his innocence. He even reportedly broke down in tears and said, "I didn't do this."
Mm-hmm.
But of course, he's presumed innocent until proven guilty.
Right. But this arrest must have been a huge moment for the victims' families. To finally have somebody in custody after all this time. I mean, I can't imagine what a mix of emotions that must be.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine the relief, but also there's probably grief and anger and the realization that the legal process is just starting.
Yeah,
It's going to be a long road, but this arrest signifies a major step toward justice.
for sure. But before we go too far into Heuermann and the investigation, let's take a minute and talk about the Gilgo Four, these women whose lives were tragically cut short. So let's start with Maureen Brainerd Barnes. She was a single mother of two who vanished in July 2007.
And she was just trying to support her family
Mm.
and then suddenly disappears. It's just devastating.
Heartbreaking. And then there's Melissa Barthelemy. She was a hairdresser who had moved from Buffalo to New York hoping for a better life.
Yeah.
And she was the one whose family received those horrifying phone calls.
Right. Those calls must have added just this extra layer of torment to their grief, To know that their daughter was not only gone, but that the person who took her was using her to hurt them.
Mm.
It's just unimaginable.
Unthinkable. And then we have Megan Waterman. She was from Maine, and she was actually a mother herself.
Yeah.
She went missing in 2010 while staying at a hotel on Long Island.
Right.
And then finally, there's Amber Costello. She was last seen in September of 2010.
And each of these women had a story. They had hopes and dreams. And to think that they were all targeted and their lives were cut short, I think it's just a stark reminder of how vulnerable certain communities are,
Yeah.
particularly women in precarious situations.
Yeah. This case really shines a light on the dangers that marginalized groups face and how their disappearances often don't get the attention they deserve.
Exactly. Their stories are often overlooked. Their lives are deemed less important. And I think this case forces us to confront that uncomfortable truth.
It does. We've covered a lot of ground, but we've really only just begun to delve into the complexities of this case.
There are still so many questions to answer, so many layers to uncover.
We've talked about the really chilling timeline of the Gilgo Beach murders and how Rex Heuermann's arrest kind of changed everything. But now that he's actually in custody, I mean, what's next? What does this all mean for the investigation moving forward?
Well, now the real work begins. Right?
Yeah.
Investigators have shifted their focus to building a rock-solid case against Heuermann. And that means, piecing together this puzzle with all the evidence they have.
Okay, so let's talk about the evidence. We know about the pizza crust DNA, but what else are they looking at?
Well, they're going to be examining everything, right?
Yeah.
From his personal belongings, his computer, phone records, his finances, anything that can connect him to the victims.
Right.
Or the crime scenes. They'll be reconstructing his movements, looking for holes in his alibi, trying to find any witnesses who might have seen something.
I mean, wouldn't it be unusual, though, for someone to commit crimes like this and leave absolutely no trace?
Not necessarily. I mean, serial killers can be incredibly meticulous.
Right.
They plan their crimes very carefully. They take steps to cover their tracks.
So what about the other victims who haven't been definitively linked to Heuermann? What are the chances he could be connected to even more cases?
That's something investigators are definitely considering, right?
Yeah.
They're looking into unsolved murders and missing persons cases, not just on Long Island, but possibly across the country.
Wow.
The possibility that he was operating in multiple states is on their radar.
That's a lot to take in. But let's shift gears for a second, talk about the victims' families. I mean, they've endured so much over the years, right? Living with this unsolved case hanging over their heads. Now they finally have an arrest. But, I mean, does that actually bring closure?
I don't know if closure is the right word.
Right.
I think the arrest might offer some relief, maybe some validation, but it also probably brings up a flood of emotions all over again,
Yeah.
Grief, anger, the realization that this legal process is just beginning.
Yeah.
And it could be a very long and draining process, and there's no guarantee of a conviction.
It's got to be a roller coaster. What do you think this arrest means for them in terms of healing?
I think it's a step forward.
Yeah.
But it's just one step on what is probably a very long and difficult journey. I think for some, it might offer a glimmer of hope, a chance to finally get justice.
Yeah.
For others, it might reopen old wounds, make the pain even sharper.
There's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to healing from something like this.
Exactly. Everyone processes trauma differently,
Yeah.
and there's no right or wrong way to grieve.
I guess so. This case has been so widely covered in the media. Do you think all the attention has helped or hurt the victims' families?
That's a really tough question. I mean, on one hand, media attention can keep the case in the public eye, and that puts pressure on law enforcement to solve it.
Yeah.
But it can also be incredibly intrusive and exploitative, especially for families that are already dealing with so much.
It's a delicate balance. But let's talk about a bigger issue that this case brings up. The vulnerability of women who are involved in sex work. These women are often overlooked, marginalized, and face really unique dangers.
Absolutely. And this case really highlights the need for more understanding and compassion for those communities.
Yeah.
They're often stigmatized and criminalized, which just makes them more vulnerable
Right.
to exploitation and violence.
And that vulnerability extends beyond just sex workers.
Yeah.
I mean, marginalized communities in general often don't receive the same level of support and protection from law enforcement.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Systemic bias and prejudice can play a significant role in how these cases are investigated and how the victims are treated.
So what needs to change? What can we do to better protect these communities and try to prevent these tragedies from happening?
I think we need a multi-pronged approach. We need better law enforcement training that focuses on understanding these communities,
Right.
and their vulnerabilities. We also need better victim advocacy programs to provide support and resources to people who are often afraid to come forward.
Sounds like we need a major shift in societal attitudes, too.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean, we need to break down the stigma and discrimination that these communities face.
Yeah.
We need to start seeing them as individuals
Yeah.
deserving of respect, dignity, and protection.
We've covered a lot in this part, and it's clear that the Gilgo Beach murders are not just about catching a killer. It's about facing some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves and where we've failed.
Yeah, we fail to protect the most vulnerable among us, and this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, we still need to delve into Heuermann himself,
Right.
his background, and what could have led him to allegedly commit these acts.
So we spent a lot of time talking about the investigation and the victims, but let's turn our attention to Rex Heuermann, the man accused of these horrific crimes. What can we learn from his background, from his personality? What might shed light on his alleged actions?
Well, that's a really complex question, and there are no easy answers, right?
Right.
But we can certainly look at what we know about Heuermann, these little pieces of information that we've been able to gather, and see if they fit into any kind of larger patterns that we often see in criminal psychology.
Okay, so we know that he was described as intelligent, but also kind of an outsider, someone who had been bullied, ostracized as a kid. Do you think that kind of social isolation could have contributed to, I don't know, a descent into darkness?
It's certainly a possibility, right? Feelings of rejection and isolation can be so damaging, especially during those key developmental years,
Yeah.
and they can breed resentment, anger, a desire for control, all things that we see in these types of cases.
And then there's the whole hunting aspect. We touched on this earlier, but Heuermann was reportedly an avid hunter, and some experts have suggested that this could be significant. What are your thoughts on that?
The hunter analogy is interesting, but I think it's important to be careful how we interpret that. I mean, there's a difference between hunting for sustenance or even for sport, right?
Right.
And hunting as a form of predatory violence.
So you're saying we can't just assume that because someone hunts, they're capable of becoming a serial killer?
Exactly. It's about looking at the whole picture. The individual's psychological makeup, their life experiences, their specific motivations.
So what about the way the victims were wrapped in burlap? So meticulously, does that tell us anything?
It could be interpreted as a sign of ritualistic behavior,
Mm.
this desire to control not just the crime scene, but the whole narrative.
Yeah.
It could also be a way of depersonalizing the victims,
Yeah.
reducing them to objects.
It's also disturbing and difficult to even try to comprehend. What are some of the broader psychological theories that might apply in a case like this?
Well, in serial killer cases, we often see themes of power and control. This need to kind of dominate and exert authority over others.
Right.
And there can also be elements of sadism, deriving pleasure from inflicting pain and suffering.
It's scary stuff. But how do we apply those theories to Heuermann? Do we even have enough information yet to really start understanding his motivations?
Well, it's still early in the investigation, and we're working with limited information, right? But we know that he maintained this outwardly normal life, this facade that hid this much darker side.
Right.
And that duality is something that we see often with serial killers, this compartmentalization, that allows them to function in society while harboring these really disturbing urges.
It's a chilling reminder that evil can really lurk beneath the surface. It makes you question who you can trust.
That's a natural reaction. I get that. But it's important to remember that cases like this, they are statistically rare. The vast majority of people are capable of empathy and compassion.
This whole case has been such an emotional roller coaster. We've talked about the victims, the investigation, the suspect. But what stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that while this case is fascinating from, a true crime perspective, it represents a very real tragedy
Yeah.
for the victims and their families.
Yeah.
And their lives were cut short, and their stories deserve to be heard and remembered.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of the human cost.
And I think beyond the individual tragedies, This case forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths about our society. It highlights the vulnerabilities of these marginalized communities, the failures of the systems that are supposed to protect them, and the need for much greater compassion and understanding.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a safer, more just world for everyone.
Exactly. This case should spark conversations, inspire action, and ultimately lead to real change.
Well, it's been a heavy deep dive, but an incredibly important one. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope our listeners have a deeper understanding of this complex case.
It's a case that's going to continue to unfold, so we encourage everyone to stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop seeking justice for these victims.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Gilgo Beach murders. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out the links in the show notes. And until next time, stay curious.